Hello, and welcome to this briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. I am Esti Yaari, Press Director of the club. Our guests today are Dr. Shira Efron, Research Director at the Israel Policy Forum, and Dennis Citrinowicz, a researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies, the INSS at Tel Aviv University. Efron and Citrinowicz recently published a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine, in which they claim that although Israel has legitimate cause for concern about our Syrian neighbors, it is now, quote, overplaying its hand in Syria and may miss an opportunity to leverage the ascendance to power of Ahmed al-Sharaa to improve the situation in his northeastern front, even while conceding that Israeli concerns are, quote, warranted. Hello, Shira and Dennis, and thank you so much for joining us today. For those who have not yet read the piece, I wonder, Shira, if you can provide us with sort of an executive summary of the case that you're laying out here, both in terms of the concerns and also perhaps, the good pointers that are going on.
Hi, Esti. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. So, I'll try to be brief because I think we can read the piece itself. The gist of the piece is that Israel has been conducting a fairly aggressive policy in Syria since the fall of the Assad regime, which happened, by the way, maybe not intentionally, but as sort of as a side effect of Israeli actions elsewhere in the region. We can get into this. But Israel has been conducting a very aggressive policy in Syria. And we argued that this is an overreach, even though we understand the risks involved with the new al-Sharaa regime in Syria, and we understand the Israel being traumatized by October 7 and the failure to protect, basically the population, right, civilians next to borders. We warn against an overreach that could backfire and maybe make us lose a rare opportunity to change the situation in Syria, undermine Iran further, and have a stable border. So, I mean, we can go into the details specifically, but I think if we look at Israel's policy towards Syria, and it changed somewhat throughout the years, but Israel's border with Syria has been fairly quiet since 1974, right? Since the agreement after the Yom Kippur 73 war. When the civil war in Syria started, Israel, privately, Israelis would say we're wishing good luck to both sides. I can say that's, behind closed doors, Israelis were preferring sort of the devil they know, Bashar al-Assad, and Israel had very specific policy goals in Syria, basically to prevent the smuggling of sophisticated weapons from Iran to Hezbollah, and making sure that Syria is not used as a front to attack Israel. When the Assad regime collapsed, Israel was left without a new Syria policy, and immediately started doing basically three things. So the first thing was preemptive strikes against different capabilities, and we could talk about specific capabilities too. And that made a lot of sense, I think, to both of us, because you want to make sure that they don't fall into the wrong hands. Not that Assad was the right hands, but at least there was a deterrent that was manageable. It was a central government. The second thing was entering the UN monitored buffer zone between the two countries, and saying that this agreement from 1974 is no longer valid. But slowly we saw Israel taking over more territory and building until what we know now is basically like 9 military posts at least. And in response and following this entrance into the buffer zones, we also had Israeli calling for demilitarization of the territory up to Damascus. And we could talk about why this is problematic. And the third thing that Israel has been doing, and these are more sort of the more recent strikes that are not in southern Syria, more towards central Syria, which we have to say the tempo has declined a little bit since the Netanyahu's meeting with Trump. But the goal of these attacks were to deter Turkey and basically tell Turkey, you cannot constrain our freedom of action in Syria, whether you need this freedom of action or not, and to what end, that doesn't matter. So those were sort of the three goals. This is all a lot. And all this time, we have a new regime in Syria. Its true colors are not known, right? Coming from with very strong jihadi credentials. So there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical, not controlling the full Syria. But on the other hand, a regime that has gone in lengths to try to signal to Israel that it does not mean to have war with Israel, that it would not use Syria to be used to attack Israel. And some, depending on who was in the room and how you heard it, even said that under certain conditions would be willing to normalize ties with Israel, whereas the word taboo, the word of peace with Israel, right? This was taboo in Syria until now. So this is where we are saying we can understand the risks, but there could be opportunities, and Israel is not a bystander in what happens in Syria, and its actions can shape the events there.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview. Risks and opportunities. I feel like this is a game we are, constantly having to navigate all the time. But, you say that al-Sharaa is, kind of looking for ways and sending messages that he wants to normalize, or, I'm not entirely sure what he wants, but something else perhaps than what had been previously the case. And the question arises, and I've heard this from a number of people, that perhaps this is actually the result of the Israeli actions, meaning the strong Israeli actions that Israel took immediately, whether it was to destroy the Assad military infrastructure, or whether it was to take the strategic Hermon. These are the things that actually allowed for this kind of messaging to come from al-Sharaa, meaning had to use Trump's peace through strength kind of idea. That in fact that this is laid the groundwork for a potential shift in view. What do you think of this perspective?
I mean, it is possible, right? Obviously, also like an asset, when we talk about in military language, also a negative asset is an asset, right? This is a way to show force, but this is exactly what we're suggesting. We're not saying any free lunch, no free lunch, and we're not questioning Israel's initial decisions to go into the buffer zone and make those preemptive strikes. And we believe there's a different way to work with Turkey on finding sort of modus vivendi in Syria, which is, by the way, happening since we wrote the article, right? Conversation started happening in Azerbaijan. So there's no question, but we're not questioning Israel's initial goals, and we're not questioning, I think, as Dennis and I are in full agreement, that these steps had to be taken. What we fear is that as we continue with a hyper-aggressive policy, we risk friction. There were already 2 incidents. We wrote in the article 2 IDF incidents a few weeks ago with near the border between IDF, and we wrote militants, but really those are like al-Sharaa, soldiers. When you have the risk of friction, we're all Israeli here, right? The more, if we'll have casualties that will drag us further in, and we are concerned that instead of using those assets and using the deterrence and using this peace through strength, right, it will be very hard for us to draw. So what we are recommending really is use Israeli position at the moment to extract very tangible concessions, right? And not fall in love with the position. Politicians, we tend in Israel to say, well, the defense minister says this, who cares? He's just a politician. No, he's the defense minister of this country. When Israel Katz says repeatedly that we will stay in Syria indefinitely, this is not a positive signal. Instead, you say we will stay in Syria until there's a capable, responsible central body on the other side. And here is the benchmark, and here are the metrics, how we're going to measure it. And in response, we're going to withdraw 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're also asking for, I don't know what guarantees, right? We can put so the signaling here is key, and having a roadmap for the next steps.
Thanks. It sounds almost kind of like, what laid the groundwork to a kind of ceasefire in Lebanon as well, right? You take all these steps so that, the other side feels like this is the right way forward for them, perhaps, if I'm understanding you correctly on some level. And if not, I'm happy for you to correct me on that. But I'd also like to get Dennis to jump in here if he has some thoughts, both in terms of where we are and perhaps how we got here as well.
Yeah. Well, again, everything, of course, that you represented, it's actually spot on in terms of what we are planning to say, to claim in the article itself. It's important to say that both of us are not naive. We don't think that, oh, now give everything to al-Sharaa and everything will be okay. We're just saying don't judge a book by its cover, meaning that the fact that the Shara used to be part of, or really an integral part of extreme jihadist movement doesn't say anything about the fact that the Shara, now president of Syria, they have to take care of all Syrians, will behave the same. We are saying we have to be skeptical, that's for sure. We're not saying everything will be optimistic, but let's see what he's doing, which action he's taking. Shara need to rebuild Syria. He need money, he need lifting of sanctions, and we can exploit that by demanding him to take concrete actions that will ease some sort of from the, let's say, say the skepticism in Israel regarding his regime. This is what we are saying. We are saying it has to be conditional. Definitely, it will take some time to understand where this regime is going. But at the end of the day, we have to remember one important thing, that if Israel see Iran as its major threat in the region, then obviously the Shara is an ally in that, because he sees that the same thing. He thinks that Iran and Hezbollah, let alone the fact that they killed hundreds, thousands of his supporters, he understands that they are undermining the stability in the region, especially undermining the stability in Syria. So this is how basically we have things aligned. We have strategy aligned in terms of needing to counter the Iranian ambition in the Middle East, and specifically in Syria and also in Lebanon, because as you know, the fact that Syria now is controlled by al-Sharaa is a major blow to the Iranian efforts to rebuild Hezbollah. So that is why we're saying, let's start by conditioning the actions, see what he's doing. Definitely his declaration are interesting in terms of how much he's positive, especially towards Israel. Let's do that and then continue forward. Let's not presume anything towards the future. And the problem that we have right now, that the action that Israel is taking, and especially not only the action, but the declaration accompanied by the action themselves, showing that Israel is trying to exploit the situation in Syria and not trying to protect itself from things that could happen in Syria. This is one. And second, of course, especially given the fact that the US is probably going to leave Syria or evacuate its soldiers over there, we have to get along with Turkey. Turkey is a problematic country for the state of Israel. It's an adversary, but we have to make sure we won't transform it to an enemy. And Syria is the events that are happening in Syria actually bring us close to friction, military friction with the Turks. We are very happy that the meeting in Azerbaijan occurred, but if Israel won't rethink its policy in Syria, then we might find ourselves in a clash with Turkey, and I don't think that this is something that we want. Definitely when Turkey is actually backed by the US. We saw how President Trump related to Erdogan in his meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So we're taking that into consideration. We are saying to the Israeli policymaker, rethink your policy, try to condition the activities or the relief of sanctions and other things that the international community trying to help al-Sharaa, and see how he's going to react in that action, in these actions. One last thing about that. We have to remember that Israel is suffering from legitimacy problems in terms of what's happening now in Gaza. We don't need to add the Syrian event. For now, it seems like Israel is the only country that does not believe in al-Sharaa or does not want to give him a chance to see whether he's able to regain control of Syria and actually counter any threat coming from this country. We see how the US is reacting. We see how the European Union, European countries is reacting. Even the Gulf states that are quite skeptical, some of them, we see that they're interacting with al-Sharaa. Israel is the only country that actually put a label on al-Sharaa itself, saying, oh, we can work with him, he's a jihadist, blah, blah, blah. So we think that, again, given that, let's not transform Syria to another piece of the puzzle of the legitimacy problem that Israel is suffering today.
That's interesting, and you touched on a number of points that I want to get into a little bit more, and also a couple of questions have come in relating to some of what you've mentioned. First of all, I would just say that just because Israel's the only one who sees them a particular way doesn't mean necessarily they're wrong. But that's a different issue based on, I think, the past 2 years or so, that I would say. That's as an aside. I don't know, obviously, who's right and who's wrong on this one, but I do think that there's The Israeli perspective has certainly been one of great suspicion coming to al-Sharaa for sure. I don't think anybody can deny that that is the case. And I think, and I think you mentioned this also in your article, partially that comes from this new approach to security that comes after October 7th. One of preemptive care, one of looking at intentions, one of looking at capabilities, all of these things together. You mentioned that quite a bit in your piece as well, kind of perhaps that is coloring the Israeli perspective here in the north as well. Which you can certainly respond to in a second, but I wanted to just ask a question relating to Turkey that has come in as well. It is reported also, I think today or yesterday, that Turkey is allowing Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to take up military positions in Syria. Even while these discussions are happening at the same time with Azerbaijan, and I wondered if you can relate to this report and what does this mean in terms of Turkey's role. And this connects to another question that has come in, which is the collapse. Didn't the collapse of the Shiite axis allow a bigger and potentially more dangerous Sunni axis to emerge? And so I feel like these are perhaps connected. And Shira or Danny, if one of you would like to take a stab at anything that I just said.
I can just start about I have not seen the report about the Turkey allowing Hamas and Jihad. I don't know if Dennis had heard anything about it. We know there's been ties between Erdogan and Hamas. This has been an issue for many, many years. But clearly, Turkey, for Turkey to advance its interests in Syria, which are economic, and have to do with other power considerations and energy and gas not being part of the IMEC, India, Mediterranean corridor, all these things. They have an interest in a stable Syria. If we have to understand, a stable Syria that is controlled by al-Sharaa all over. And sort of and of course, there's the Kurdish question, which is a domestic political question, and of course the border, but interesting developments there as well. But we need to understand that in terms of the core interest of Turkey, they want a stable Syria, and stable Syria means that al-Sharaa controls the whole government. So to me, it sounds, I don't know that Turkey would actively pursue a policy of strengthening terrorist positions there that would necessarily, and for sure, and with all legitimacy, like have Israeli strengthen, but it'd be interesting to see. That does not mean that Turkey is not a big problem for Israel. I just want to say, like, if you're Israeli and you live here, the supermarkets look a little bit empty. We have no trade with Turkey. They didn't let the Israeli planes use their airspace even to go to the talks in Azerbaijan. Okay, to reconcile with them. There are real issues here with Turkey that are not motivated by political, right? It's an issue. But as Dennis said, like, we're not going to go into a war with a NATO country as strong, the second strongest military in NATO, and Israel and Turkey, despite everything, have shared interests. And Turkey and Syria could be the laboratory where this is. I think, based to the question, it's very convenient for us Israelis, right, to put the divide the world and divide the Middle East into camps and axis, right? Oh, we replace the Shiite axis with the Muslim Brotherhood now. But the fact is, there are very different interests between Turkey and Qatar and Muslim Brotherhood. And, I'll let Dennis address this more, but I think it's a little bit more simplistic, and we should actually analyze the nuances and divergences and try to capitalize on those to make sure that Israel has what it needs, which is a stable Syria that is not at war with Syria, that doesn't fall again into the Iranian orbit. I mean, I think this is right. If we knew, I'm just going to say, like this, you mentioned also Lebanon. If we knew, and this is large part of Israeli actions, right? A year and a half ago, you would say that Assad would be gone, and you'll have a leader that says those things. We still have to question to judge him by what he does and not just by what he says, but says those things. And Joseph Aoun is the president of, I mean, we would be saying that we're dreaming. So now that this opportunity may have emerged, we don't know, let's help it. That's all. I'm sure Dennis says something.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you. I want to say a couple of things. First, Generally speaking, Israel cannot solve its problem only by the use of kinetic force, even after 7th of October. And we have a live example in Gaza Strip these days. But Israel can, continue the war in Gaza, but we can see the price that we are paying and we will pay in the future. And I think that at the end of the day, everybody's talking about the day after. The day after has to have political solution to the problem. Same thing goes to Lebanon, that we definitely, the fact that we have a kinetic upper hand in terms of our activity, kinetic activity, of course, we earn from that, and we can see the positive developments in the Lebanese political system. At the end of the day, we have to negotiate with the Lebanese government about the border dispute. So at the end of the day, the final mile has to be a political one. It cannot be just using force. Unfortunately, after 7th of October, we keep saying to ourselves, yeah, if we'll have a threat, imminent threat, we'll attack it, whatever. But look what's happening now, even with the Iranian and the US negotiation on nuclear side. Even in the US, they understand that. So in the end of the day, yes, kinetic force is important, but you have to have political activity, political solutions to your problem. It's not that I cannot rely on them. Okay, you cannot rely on Shira, so what you will do, let's assume that tomorrow there will be problem between the Druze and Shira in Germany. What we'll do, we'll send the commando units to Germany to protect the Druze. At the end of the day, we have to remember that we have also glass ceiling to our capabilities. So that is one important aspect I think we also wanted to highlight in the article itself. The second thing regarding the Palestinian issue, al-Sharaa actually arrested two Palestinian jihadist members last week. And what we want to do, if they will build capabilities to attack us from Syria, surely we want al-Sharaa and the Syrian army to have the capabilities to stop them. How are they going to stop them if we're preventing weaponry or preventing rearmament of the Syrian army right now? So we have to think that in mind. What do we want to do in that aspect? And if if they won't be strong enough, then we'll see again Iran and Hezbollah exploiting the void in Syria. So again, what we earn from that. This is the second thing. Regarding Turkey, again, you won't find me defending, especially in Shira, defending Turkey in that regard. Definitely, it's a problematic country. But we have to remember that it's a NATO country, like Shira said, very strong country. And Turkey is not Iran in terms of its relations with Israel. We still have relations with them. We still, as the meeting happened in Azerbaijan, we still have close proximity. We have to remember also our economical interest in terms of oil flooding from Azerbaijan through Turkey. So in that regard, this is an important country. And last but not least, let's not, like Shira said, simplify a thing and say, oh, now there is no Shia access, there is Sunni access. You cannot compare between the relations between Iran and the proxies and the relations between Turkey, al-Sharaa, and Qatar. It's not the same thing, period. Now, I'm sure that people are looking for a rivalry and all the time, or enemies that we can invent for their own interest. But at the end of the day, yes, it's problematic. Yes, Turkey is problematic towards the state of Israel, but it's not an enemy to the state of Israel. We can interact with it. And if we continue our dangerous activity in Syria and not interacting with the Shara and try, like we mentioned yesterday, to see whether it is able to implement what he's claiming out in the open, and interact with Turkey about that, we can find ourselves losing both ways. Not interacting with the Shara, he will be, I won't say enemy to the state of Israel, but he won't serve our interests, especially in the Iranian case. But also we can find ourselves in a kinetic friction with the Turks, because for them, al-Sharaa is an important element in their ability to rebuild their capabilities in the Middle East. So, and I think that at the end of the day, it's not, look, there are no simple solutions to our problems. But thinking that relying on kinetics can help us solve our problems, this is a major problem. Let's assume what will happen, theoretically speaking. If the Turks tomorrow declaring a no-fly zone in northern Syria, then what Israel will do, I think that we have to coordinate with them. We have to work with them, understanding the limitation that we have and they have in the relationship, especially when the war in Gaza continuing. And see, because I'm sure that the Turks doesn't have the interest as well to find a type of restriction in Israel. We can use also the US, because the US, as I mentioned, supports Israel, support Turkey especially in both countries' endeavors in the Middle East. So I think in that regard, we have to use also Washington, or can help you, Washington or Azerbaijan, as we can see what happened or what occurred last week, because this is a country that actually an ally for both countries, Israel and Turkey. So the bottom line of things, we really believe that we need to rethink our policy, needs to change our policy. Don't think every Arab or every Muslim as an automatic adversary to the state of Israel. We have to think how we can work to serve Israel interests the best. And we believe that attacking, bombing, maybe sometimes it's necessary, but if you're doing that automatically without thinking about the implications, does not serve Israeli interest for the short time, for the short range, also definitely for the long range in terms of how we see Israel interest in the Middle East in general.
Okay, I think again, a lot going on there, a lot to unpack. Some of the things that you talked there, certainly I think that there's perhaps a difference, if I'm understanding what you and Shira are saying and what you wrote, a difference in how you see Israel's immediate post-Assad falling policy versus Israel's policy today, and how that has shifted over time, and perhaps the need for that, if I'm understanding you correctly, in terms of how things can shift. But you mentioned also some of the minorities in Syria. You mentioned the Druze, for example. We see that there are things happening with the Druze and the Kurds similarly, and with the drawing of American troops and presence from Syria. And I know we're nearing the end of our time, and there's just two more kind of questions that I currently have. So if there's any other questions coming in, journalists, this would be your time. One relating to the role of what's going to be happening with the minorities in Syria. Does Israel have any kind of, Israel was talking about helping the Druze, maybe, there's a lot of relationships with the Kurds. Does Israel have any role there to play? Should it have a role there to play, or should it stay far away? And of course, how does the role of the US play into that? And then the other one has to do with the economy, which I'm going to come back to as soon as we address the minorities. So I don't, perhaps Shira.
So Dennis, why don't you take the minorities, and I could do, sort of the economy,
Sure.
And maybe also I want to say a word about Russia, which I think is interesting.
Sure. Just so in a nutshell, look, definitely when looking at the minorities in Syria, the closest minority to Israel, of course, are the Druze, for historical reasons. And we can see Israel endeavor to protect them in a way by the declaration coming, especially from our defense minister on that. Of course, there are tensions right now in Syria, and we are looking at them closely to understand better how things will develop. But we have to remember one important thing. They are Syria citizens, and there is limitations to Israel's ability to interact and to protect also the minorities in Syria as a whole. I'm not saying we shouldn't help them or see how we can protect them in a way that will serve our interests, but we cannot solve any problem that now Syria will have between the central regime and the minorities by protecting them. It's endless. What will happen then? They will attack them, like I said, in Germana. What we'll do, we'll land forces in Germana to protect them. At the end of the day, yes, we need to see how we can help them, how we can secure them. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that we have limitations, and the bottom line is that they are Syrian citizens, not an Israeli citizen. This is one. And the other is also respected to the Alawites, and especially what happened in the clashes between al-Sharaa and the Alawites around the seashore of Syria, especially in the area like Tus and others. Will the Alawi actually there are we can see a lot of population that are Alawites descendant in that regard. And again, returning back to that, what Israel can do, if we'll make the declaration that we are protecting all minorities in Syria, then what we'll do, we'll work with people like Bassam Hassan that now rebuilding Alawite forces to fight against the central Syrian regime. What will be the end game for that? We'll find ourselves in a mix of Syrian civilian clashes. I think that we have to be very wary not to get involved in those issues. Now, Israel cannot be the protector, or same thing go to the Kurds. First, definitely we have good relations with the Kurds in Iraq and Syria and so forth. But again, okay, let's assume that there will be clashes, although I think now the interaction between the Kurds and the Syrian central regime is such that I don't think there will be some sort of a clash. We have to wait and see, but it seems to be that there is some sort of an agreement between them about embedding the Kurds into, especially to the Syrian army. But let's assume that it won't happen. There will be clashes. What we'll do then? We'll bomb al-Sharaa or maybe the Turks, or in the clash in the eastern part of Syria. So I think that saying that Israel is defending of minorities in the Middle East, where it starts, when it's going to end. We have to be very cautious in that regard, and I think that we have limitations to our ability to help them. So I think that we have to be very considerable when we're discussing or making declarations that we're not able to sustain, especially when Israel is involved in other more important fronts than the defending the minorities in Syria.
Okay, and then the question that I had here about the economy, this is reported, I believe, in the New York Times today or yesterday. That Saudi Arabia and Qatar have announced that they will pay Syria's $15 million debt to the World Bank, potentially unlocking millions of dollars in aid and giving a boost to the new government's task of rebuilding the economy. At the same time, we know that some 90% of Syrians live in poverty, a quarter of them are also unemployed. And the question that's being asked is, what does this mean for the stability of Syria? And what kind of impact would that then have on al-Shara's ability to govern, both in terms of and to make all kinds of agreements or peace or whatever? How much pressure would that put on the new Syrian regime?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think this is where there's real difference, right? There's al-Sharaa and his government have made a substantial effort for Damascus to look very different because everyone's coming to Damascus. What we're hearing is that the periphery and other areas, rural areas of the country, are ruled by, poverty. And we have to remember that Assad wasn't just a vicious dictator, right? This was a criminal state governed by crime, criminal gangs, a Coptagon trade that he's trying to raid, but it takes time, and there are no substitutes for there are no economic engines at the moment. So from Syria's perspective, and I think for all of us perspective, it's a good news the decision by Saudi and Qatar to close the debt. But there's no question that the most urgent priority for al-Sharaa is sanction relief. And we would argue that these statements about even normalization and peace with Israel, this is their purpose, right? You want to create and some sort of engines, but this could be coming because, as Dennis said before, it seems that the whole international community, so if Israel is willing, or and Russia maybe, although that depends, is banking on is willing to give him a chance, and that will require sanction relief. But there needs to be more than that, right? There needs to be very, very, very serious humanitarian assistance, reconstruction, all these things. And because Iran was the main actor pumping money into Syria, right, with Russia throughout the years, now you need to create a coalition of others willing to do the same. I think there's a role for Israel here, by the way. First of all, in terms of the relationship with Washington, deciding on specific, but if Israel were to say, okay, if we see 1, 2, 3, 4, and we don't have time to go into the details of what Israel expects to see, we will support sanction relief, or at least not lobby against it, right? Or some sanctions. This is one area working through Washington. But also, as we're looking at water issues in Syria, which are terrible, right? And especially the border, the triangle with southern Syria and Jordan and Israel, food security issues, energy issues, humanitarian supply, reconstruction. These are areas where Israel can actually show positive power, right? It's not instead of the kinetic stuff. We will continue to do the kinetic stuff as needed, but this is the time to capitalize on all these amazing military achievements, and with a strategic with a strategy that's much more comprehensive. But there's no question that if al-Sharaa can't improve the economy, it's going to be very, very difficult for him to deliver to the Syrians, who for the first time in decades are happy, but they also need a tangible improvement to their lives. Just if I can, a final word about Russia. It's been interesting because Israel fearing sort of this Turkey taking over Syria has been in good relationship with Russia, and Israel should be in good relationship with Russia and has always been throughout the years. But there's a sense that Israel is working with Russia and lobbying toward keeping the Russian bases in Syria as a counterweight to the Turks. And this is something where I'm hearing puzzlement from Israeli partners, by the way, including in the US. And even though President Trump is on and off with Putin, it doesn't matter about this, right? The idea is the thought that Russia will play a constructive role in Syria after it was the actor that most, thanks to Syria, basically we got Iran in, sorry, thanks to Russia, we got Iran in Syria. The levels is to me puzzling, and also I'm not sure it's going to work. So if Russia is going to keep 2 bases here, you think Turkey is not going to take other bases? So this is also in terms of like, are we thinking long-term enough, and what is the messaging? It's not Israel alone. There's a whole international community here, and we just ought to be careful and clear-eyed about what we can and we cannot do, and we can do a lot. That's the thing. So I'll end with that.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing about Syria and Russia and Israel connection with Russia. We have to remember that Russia and Iran are strategic partnership cooperation, put in just to prove the strategic pact that both countries have signed. I don't have to even remind us how Russia is helping Iran rebuild its capabilities in space, in missiles, hopefully not in nuclear. In that regard. So if we think that with the help of Russia, we're able to preserve our interest in Syria, it's like giving the cat the ability to preserve the milk. And that's not going to happen. But unfortunately, we see that strategic behavior in a way that it's not only regarding Syria. We see that there is some sort of a notion in the Israeli decision maker that we're able to rely on Russia to solve problems of Israel in the Middle East. And I think that it's a major mistake that actually, if we'll continue to do that, we'll pay a severe price for it. We cannot rely on the Russians whatsoever. And I think that they proved that in their relations with the Iranians.
Certainly, I think, probably one of the key things right now is, of course, preventing and having prevented Syria from continuing to serve as that land bridge between Iran and Lebanon and Hezbollah, to continue to do so. And so you're speaking about relying on Russia, bringing Russia in. It reminds me of when President Obama was like, we'll bring the Russians in to help with the chemical weapons. That's just kind of a throwback to that, as you're discussing bringing the Russians into Syria. We have just one last question that has come in, and I think this may be relates to kind of the impact, and that is, do any key policymakers in the government agree with you on Syria, and have you had any kind of echo there to your thoughts? Shira?
I don't interact so much with the politicians, so we say government, but Danny, I don't know if it's safe to say that at least the circles that I know of officials in the defense establishment, different bodies, received this with, we got very positive responses and a complete agreement about the fear of overreach and not seeing the opportunities, or at least the assumption that the opportunities will always be there. So I think we sort of dared to air out something that is discussed, unfortunately not by our politicians. I don't know if this is accurate, Dennis, what are you hearing?
I totally agree with you. I think it's really on the spot in terms of what we are hearing. And I think that there are, at the end of the day, we can see there are questions about the Israeli policy towards Syria. And I think this article is actually echoing those questions. And I think, again, I don't want to relate to us, but I think it's important because of the fact that we're in a timely manner in terms of the Israeli policy towards Syria and the danger of finding ourselves in the backlash with the Turks and not capitalizing on al-Sharaa or the fact that Shira need the international help. And then I think we believe we can use that in order to influence its policy. So definitely, I think there is understanding that something needs to be changed. Now, again, as Shira, I'm not in direct connection with our politicians, so definitely I don't know how they are seeing that, or how are they able to be influenced by more, let's say, professional people that are dealing with this arena. But I think it's also connected to something that's more deeper than just the Syrian case. And I think, again, we don't have much time to discuss that as well in terms of the Israel decision maker or decision-making process in terms of the strategic issues on the table right now in terms of Iran, Syria, Gaza, and other things. And the relations and the, let's say, problematic relations between the decision maker, the politicians, and the experts. And something that, of course, we didn't write in the article, but I think it's coming along from that is the fact that the decision making is becoming more populist and less driven by facts and by interest. And we see that also in Syria. The fact that the prime minister, the defense minister, is running to the Hermon mountain to declare things that I think that about the Israeli presence in this area for a longer period of time, I think is also not connected only to the, let's say, security interest, but also the political interest of both of them. And of course, I'm not naive. We are not naive. We know that politics, political considerations, all been part of the decision-making process. But now we see, I think, especially on the 7th of October, especially given the problematic relations between decision makers and the professionals from the security establishment, we think that it's maybe even more stretched. And this is something that we think that we see that happening in Syria, but unfortunately not only in Syria. And this is, I finish with that, but I think this is something that we need to see how things will develop there, because we have to have checks and balances. We have to have decision-making process that actually will take into account everything related to the interest and even the political interest, but everything has to be a blend. And now we think that we see that the politics and the political considerations are, let's say, I think when we're looking at the last decisions, are maybe a little bit taking control of other interests that Israel need to take into consideration regarding Syria, but also not regarding Syria. And I'll finish with that.
Thank you. Shira, did you have something you need to add? Because we're going to wrap it up here.
No, I agree with Dennis. I think this is just like, if there's, it's not a paradox, but I think the Israeli mindset is there are two principles that sort of govern it, right, at post October 7th. So the first one is the trauma and not letting that mistake happen again, right? We're not taking any chances. We have to trust ourselves and make sure that our civilians are not in danger again, like it was. So that's on the one hand. And the second one is kind of, and this dovetails to what Dennis just said, is being emboldened by the military successes and not getting, or a sense of we're not getting any pushback, especially since the election in the US, that we can do whatever we want and we will not suffer consequences. So I think this is sort of the juxtaposition of both of them, and the convergence of both of them guide decision making. Of course, everything is highly politicized now in Israel. But I do hope we will have, where this is sort of the eve of Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day in Israel, and Independence Day, and I hope we will emerge stronger and smarter from all of this.
Well, I hope so as well. So on that note, I think that you have given us a lot to think about, and a lot to unpack, some of which we can do a whole separate session just on some of the things that have been said. So I'd like to thank you, Shira and Denny, very much for joining us, and thank you, of course, to my colleague Jonathan Beck for facilitating this briefing. And as you say, as we head into Remembrance Day and Independence Day, we of course remember the thousands who gave their lives and their families. And we wish you very best wishes for a very happy Independence Day and good news going forward. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.